Hey, Craig.
Hey Simon,
What do you have for me today?
I have a is it succinct or succinct? I think it's
Succinct.
succinct.
Yeah.
Yes, journey through a mere 100 years of pop culture, discussing various ways that pop culture trends have been interpreted as manifestations of societal anxieties, leading up to the age of YouTube.
Like, for instance, like quicksand being this trope that you saw in a lot of movies in like the 70s and early 80s, that was somehow a manifestation of something in our collective psyche, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a famous one. That was the one that Radiolab did their episode on. I am dubious about that one, and I'll get into why. But that was actually going to be part of my sort of probing. Is yeah, what do you know about kind of these various examples of interpreting kind of pop culture trends as reflecting, I guess, like societal anxieties or world events? And you named one, which is the quicksand one.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of any trends specifically. Like, obviously, there's the individual movies, like Godzilla being about, reflective of like Japan's view on nuclear war and their kind of recovery from it. I'm trying to think if there are any other like trends in cinema or pulp culture that I think of as being somehow tied to. I mean, obviously, there's always examples in like music and stuff like that. Singing about certain things and stuff. Um,
Yeah,
okay,
I didn't even get into music,
yeah. So this is all
but
like
yeah,
cinema and TV and stuff like that.
cinema and TV. Yeah,
Yeah,
the moving image.
yeah. I'm kind of drawing a blank, even though I watch a lot of TV and movies and stuff like that, and listen to a lot of film podcasts and stuff. I'm not, other than the quicksand example, I can't really think of many.
Well, we'll cover the quicksand example in a bit, and a lot of these you're probably going to be able to figure out along the way. But I'll just kind of probe you as I'm going with kind of each example. So it is a kind of tried and true. I guess you could almost call it English major strategy for looking at pop culture, which is to look at a development as like a manifestation of collective societal anxieties. And my 3 hours of, oh, wait a minute, we didn't do the thing. What's the name of the podcast?
Oh, it is Momentary Experts, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube.
All right. So my 3 hours of turning into a momentary expert today was inspired by, and we briefly covered it last time, but thinking about YouTube. But yeah, I was getting into these kind of examples, and actually the one I started with was the quicksand one, which is the one I probably spend the least amount of time on because there's a big long Radio Lab episode on it, and I didn't really just want to repeat what they said.
Yeah, and there might be people watching this who have no idea what we're talking about because they didn't grow up at a time when we did, when we saw this quicksand thing in pop culture. So either we could talk about it now, or maybe you're going to talk about it later. But we should at some
I'll
point
get
explain.
into it.
Yeah,
It's number, I think it's number three. Yeah, it's number three on my list. So yeah, we will get there. Um, but there's a tried and true sort of approach to looking at a trend in pop culture and then saying, what kind of societal anxiety is this giving voice to? Why are people attracted to this particular topic or type of film or type of TV show? So, one of the earliest ones is the popularity of musicals during the 1930s, right? So, I mean, there was like the endless Fred Astaire, Ginger Roger films. Shirley Temple as a kid was the number one box office draw from 1934 to 1938. It was just musicals, 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 and you can probably like, why do you think that sort of like song and dance was so popular in the 1930s? What was going on in the 1930s?
so in the 1930s there was the Great Depression. So, and I mean that was the main thing. Obviously, there were things that were starting to heat up in Germany and stuff that led to other things that. But in terms of like the everyday American life, yeah, the Great Depression, high unemployment rate, bread lines, everything like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything was bad. So uh, the massive popularity of just sort of like happy song and dance laden movies. Everything's nice. Everyone's singing and dancing. Everyone's happy. There's nothing to think about. Has been interpreted as, at least partially, just the fact that when everything else sucks so much, right? You're going to be attracted to going to movies and just look for escapism, right? You don't want to think about how bad everything is. And I learned during this deep dive. So you see a lot of articles about how like homelessness is at an all-time high, and there's more homeless than ever, right? That's like
I mean,
a
it's
trend.
it's certainly. I mean, it's a thing that like the Fox Newses of the world tried
Mm-hmm.
to hype. I don't know what the general statistics are. If that's an act, like you're always learning that crime is up, but it really isn't. In a lot of instances, there's always this perception that crime is high, but in a lot of like historically we have low crime. I don't know if historically we have high homelessness or whatever.
Well, it's nowhere near the all-time high, which is the Great Depression. So during the height of the Great Depression, there were 2 million homeless people. Currently, there are about 650,000, and we have 3 times the population that they had during the Great Depression. So, in order for the number of homeless to even approximate percentage-wise what it was during the height of the Great Depression, as an illustration of how bad things were, you would need 6 million homeless people today. So 10 times the amount, right? So yeah, things were awful. Everyone's unhappy. 40% unemployment. 2 million homeless. Squatters camps everywhere. People just want to go to the movies and watch Shirley Temple sing about the good ship lollipop and boop boop a doop, right? It
Yeah.
makes sense,
So it
right?
wasn't just musicals; they were kind of like upbeat storylines and stuff like that.
Yeah, musicals, upbeat storylines. Again, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing together and looking very pretty, right? It was popcorn, right? People just wanted popcorn. They wanted to go to the movies and forget about how shit everything was for a while, right? That one I buy, it makes sense. Now, a recurring problem, and I'll get into this too, with a lot of these is that it's purely theoretical, right? Because we don't have a way to actually measure it, except maybe now we do. But I'll get into that later. So that's the first example. That's a common one. The second one is TV westerns and the popularity of the western genre specifically in the 1950s.
Yeah, and so just to kind of interrupt you a little bit on that is like I've read about this, and you know how you think about like superhero movies today where like they're just dominate the box office, and there's now like 20 superhero movies a day, and like people have written about like why that's probably going to go away, and they use westerns as like being analogous to it. Is that there was a time when like the westerns was the modern, what we consider today to be the superhero movie, in the sense of like they were just everywhere. They're like the it seemed like the public's thirst for westerns was insatiable, and if you were watching pop culture during this time, just like maybe when at the height of the superhero craze, you thought this would just go on forever, when in fact it was kind of like a weird historical anomaly that like westerns were super popular.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a pretty good analogy. Is with the sort of the endless glut of Marvel movies and all of the superhero TV shows, and it seemed like it was everywhere for a long time, and still kind of is. But I think already it's kind of starting to wane a little bit. Any kind of pop culture trend will have a rush of titles, and then it will fall away. So yeah, it's a pretty good analogy to compare like westerns in the 1950s to superhero movies, except you're still nowhere near it. It turns out. Um, this is one of those moments when I was, becoming a momentary. I was shocked. Wikipedia lists 88 different TV shows in the 1950s that are Western themed, as in set in the Old West. Also in the 1960s, 88 again. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap here. But then I went to 2000 to 2010 and I counted the number of TV shows set in the Old West. So 88 in the 50s, 88 in the 60s. How many do you think there were from 2000 to 2010?
2000, 10.
Four.
Yeah, one of them was
Four. There were
Deadwood.
Yes, one of them was Deadwood. There were four American shows, two miniseries, which they also counted. and 2 Canadian series. They also listed Breaking Bad and Sons of Anarchy, which I guess are like new westerns. I mean,
No,
they
they're not
kind of have
westerns.
a western feel. Yeah, I
No,
know,
yeah.
right? It's like they are in the
Um,
western part of the United States, but they're not westerns.
my dad watches tons of westerns. Like whenever I'm
Hmm.
home, he just like I think there's a channel that just plays westerns all the
Oh
time,
yeah,
and he's just always watching them.
yeah, yeah. That's just and also when you consider how many fewer TV channels there were in the 1950s as opposed to the 2000s. You did a deep dive last week on the history of TV. How many channels were there in 1955 in the average American home?
Like four, maybe.
Yeah, and there were 88 Western TV shows. It just must have been that like that's the only thing that's on aside from the news
Yeah, yeah.
is
So
just westerns,
so it
right?
was like Marvel on steroids. It would be as if it like
Yeah,
every single TV show right now
yeah.
was like a superhero show.
With movies, it's even crazier. Wikipedia lists. I had to add this up in a calculator. 1,257 movies in the 1950s in the Western genre.
Wow. Okay, so
Do you want to guess what it is from 2000 to 2010 that they list? 116.
okay, respectable number, but yeah, much lower.
Yeah. Still nowhere near, right? Yeah, so it would be like if superheroes, yeah, but like times 10. It would literally the only content that people are consuming are westerns. So what do we take from this?
So 1950s, 1960s. This is the height of the Cold War. We're scared of communists and stuff like that. Westerns represent some kind of rugged individualism when the great frontier when we lived by our own set of codes and there was like a swift justice. So am I hitting on anything that ties to
Yeah, and actually that hadn't even occurred to me was the whole Cold War aspect. But it that's like a really good point too because you did hit on the thing that makes us American, the thing that makes us uniquely American. If you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked briefly about this idea of the myth of American exceptionalism, right? So not exceptional in the way that like what makes us great, but what makes us unique. Do you remember what that was?
I remember you saying what makes us unique is that um, we colonized somewhere and then split off from our previous.
Kind of, yeah. So the myth of American exceptionalism was in large part sort of like it was articulated very early on by people like Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson conceptualized the United States as basically being this, disregarding the millions of people who already lived there, this sort of endless wilderness, and that people could build a farm and then farm that farm, and then their kids would move like 2 miles down the road, and they'd have their own little farm, and then their kids would grow 2 miles down the road, and they'd have their own little farm, and that would keep going forever, right? And the myth of American exceptionalism is that because the United States was a country that came out of like the European tradition of culture, but was founded without aristocracy or royalty, that it was free from the inherited sort of class systems and oppressions that Europe had dealt with for centuries, right? That was the idea of American exceptionalism, and it came to be embodied in the public consciousness by the West. The endless frontier, go west, young man. The West became synonymous with freedom. It became synonymous with the American ideal of individualism, with a place that you could go and using only the labor of your hands, you could make a life, right? By the 1950s, a couple things are happening. One, you said the Cold War, right? And the Cold War was very much an othering experience, right? You've got this giant evil entity against which you need to define yourself, right? So you need to define, you're right, what makes us uniquely
And
American.
the entity is like a form of collectivism,
Exactly. Yeah, that's a
communism. Yeah,
really good point. That
yeah.
had not even occurred to me, but that's probably more convincing than the one that I had come up with, which was that sort of at the same time you've got a population of people who now, are living and working under the people who are sort of like owning TVs and watching TVs who grew up during that full tilt transition away from being a rural society to a predominantly urban society, right? There's rapid urbanization. to the point where like the West is officially closed, right? Like we've hit the ocean, California dreaming, it's booming. There is no more West, right? We live in cities now, and so there's going to also, I think, there be a certain amount of anxiety in that when your national identity is built on this idea of the endless frontier and being able to go west and build and make a living out of the land, when there's no more west, right, then what does that do for your national identity, right? So there has to be sort of like a reassessment there. um, what ended up happening was that for a while anyway, the freedom of the west was transposed into the freedom of the open road, right? Like we're probably the only country that associates the existence of a road with freedom. Freedom of the open road. You can drive anywhere and you can go all the way to Utah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and why we're
But
the only country that's like resistance to like public transportation and high speed trains and stuff like that.
yeah, because it's you and it's you alone and you're on the road on your hog or on your car and it's the freedom of the open road, right? It was just sort of like a transposition of this same idea. But yeah, you're right. So one, you've got this sort of like switch into urbanization. What does that mean when there is no more sort of like west to go to? And then two, yeah, you've got the Cold War and this collectivist sort of faceless entity, and you have to figure out how to define yourself against it in order to uh, know who you are and you know why they're evil and why you're good. And so both of these things, I think the image of the what does every Western show have in common? They're almost all, at least in the 1950s, and most of the movies too. Think about Shane, for example. It is the lone hero who rides into town. He has no family ties. He has no business ties. He doesn't need these things. He lives by his wits and his gun and his cunning and his muscle and his punching. And he rides into town and he rights some wrongs and he fights some bad guys. And then typically, yeah, one of the women in the town, like Cheyenne, is another great example of that kind of show. And then he rides out of town at the end of the day, right? Because he doesn't want to stick around. He's not tied to anything, right? He is a rugged individual staring steely gazed into the distance. And so for a country that was wrestling both with sort of the consequences of urbanization, with the need to reassess national identity in that context, and trying to define yourself against this thing that is now the enemy and is global and worldwide, I think the Western provided a way to do that for people. It was a form of escapism that allowed them to reconnect with what they still held to be, you know, the American identity, this myth of American exceptionalism, even though that was no longer embodied in any real way anywhere, assuming it ever had been, because again, like, it always conveniently ignored the fact that there were already millions of people here. It wasn't a wilderness at all. They had to, you had to clear it out of people in order to then imagine that it was this like virgin wilderness, but that's neither here nor there. That's why it's the myth of American exceptionalism. So you get in the 50s and then in the 60s this explosion of westerns, right? The 60s is also when we get to quicksand. So Radiolab had a great episode on this, and for people listening who don't sort of have any context and who didn't watch a lot of TV from the 60s, if you had grown up then, and even for us who didn't grow up in the 60s,
Well,
who
we grew up in the
were
'80s, but we were watching
yeah,
these reruns on TV
yeah,
and stuff like that.
you
Yeah,
yeah, you would be forgiven for assuming that quicksand would have been a much more consistent problem in the world
yeah, and
than
some
it ended up being.
yeah. So for more context, there would always be some. Our protagonist would be walking somewhere, usually in a jungle or something like that, and they would fall into quicksand, and it would be like a major point of conflict that they would have to solve. Or sometimes like they would stage a character's death that way, and it was just like it was always this horrifying thing because what is quicksand? It's this thing where the more you struggle and the more you try to figure out
Right.
how to get out of it, the faster it sucks you into it. And
Yeah,
so
precisely.
it's like this incredibly slow drowning death, basically.
Yeah. And so then I'm assuming you also know what like the most common interpretation of quicksand is then in this
No.
sort of idea. The idea is that, in the 60s, we're getting involved in Vietnam, we had just gotten involved in Korea, we're getting involved in all these wars overseas. A metaphor that was used is the quagmire. Like we're getting bogged down in a quagmire in Vietnam. We're getting bogged down in a quagmire, right? And so yeah, so in the 19, so I looked up the numbers, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but 3% of all movies in the 1960s had quicksand.
I mean, that's certainly
But
way more than today. There's
yeah, right?
three out of every
Yeah,
100, and it's
yeah,
so the theory that Radiolab put in is because it was like Vietnam, really.
yeah. That's the theory, right? Because it was occasionally described as a quagmire, right? And I'm dubious about this
Yeah,
one, honestly.
this sounds like I believe the Western part and I believe
Hmm.
the musical part. I have a hard time believing that like somehow subconsciously a screenwriter was like worried about Vietnam and so decided to to exemplify that through
Yeah,
quicksand.
and also it's that so it's like I don't know. The reason that I'm dubious about it is because it's one of these things that isn't driven necessarily by like ratings or by people's engagement. Like people are like, "Oh, I got to go tune into this show because they had quicksand once," right? So this is just purely looking at the choice of writers to write something and then trying to find something to map it onto. And people did occasionally refer to Vietnam as a quagmire, but it wasn't until like the late 60s that the majority of Americans even opposed military involvement in Vietnam. So it wasn't like everyone thought of it as a quagmire. I mean, I think just as logical of an explanation for quicksand is that it was an easy way to inject some like artificial tension into a
Yeah,
plot.
like maybe like one famous movie did it and it just kind of like caught on.
Hmm. Yeah, and then if you're in a studio, you're producing a bunch of shows. You know you got the quicksand pit. There's people who know how to make it. It's cheap. It's easy to do. It can either serve a comedic purpose or it can serve like a dramatic purpose, right? And then so you get it becomes popular for a while, a mixture of novelty and convenience, and then yeah, it almost immediately evaporates, right? And then by the 70s, it's down to like less than 1%, and now it's down to like less than a quarter of a percent or something like that, right? It just doesn't happen very often. Um, and yeah, so that's why I'm dubious about it. I mean, I'll listen to the argument, but I'm not sold, right? Just because I don't see like the clear cut connection. I think the Western one is much stronger to me, simply because of the sort of I mean the ubiquity of westerns and also these like very huge changes that are going on. I tried to look up like what percentage of news reports referred to Vietnam as a quagmire. I couldn't even find any numbers about that. I don't think it was like I don't get the sense that it was as ubiquitous as we think it is now, right? It's become a metaphor now, but I don't know how common it was. So that's why I'm kind of dubious about this one. And then, there are other trends that people have tried to do. Again, this is a tried and true method. And I'm also dubious as to some others, for example, right? So, um, a very common, again, sort of, and I'm using the term disparagingly, even though I was myself an English major, um, but like an English major way to kind of interpret something. What are zombie
Yeah, I was just gonna
films?
ask about zombies, but I just don't
Right?
know how many zombie films there were outside of the Dawn of the whatever those what were the what's the famous one? Is it Dawn of the Dead or something like that?
Night of the Living Dead was
Night
the
of the Living
first
Dead.
one.
Yeah.
That
So
was in like
so,
1969,
so
I want to say.
was there an explosion of zombie movies that were not made by George whatever his name was?
I mean, yeah, there was a bunch,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
pretty much kicked off again by the sequel, Dawn of the Dead, which
Yeah.
takes place in a shopping mall,
Yeah.
right? And so it's,
So the
yeah,
zombies are consumers, right? But
yeah,
didn't isn't that what he said? Like it wasn't like this. It wasn't. He was like interviewed about that, and so to him that's what they represented. I don't know any other zombie movies that were made necessarily. Their thoughts what were that they represented the consumer or
yeah.
something like that.
And again, I don't, yeah. So I mean, there was a bunch of zombie movies in the 70s, and then there was a bunch more in the 80s, and there's still a bunch. There was a bunch more after like 28 Days Later, but I've never, again, I don't really buy the whole manifestations of like anxiety over consumerism because I have a I guess I just have a difficult time imagining that people are so anxious in the 1980s over being able to conveniently get to a Bloomingdale's that they're seeing in that anxiety of the food court. a horde of zombies that wants to tear them to pieces. I don't necessarily buy it, right? It seems like it's like it's always struck me as an analogy that is made by people who want to sound like smart and enlightened, right? Like, oh, they're all consumers, zombies, because they're shopping at a mall, right? But like, I don't see like many societal like anxieties there. I don't buy that so many people were worried about shopping malls, which existed in the 70s too, that they're like, oh yes, in the zombies tearing somebody apart alive and eating their dead flesh and causing the collapse of all society. Yes, I see what terrifies me about a J.C. Penney sale.
Yeah, and plus, like, there was just one movie set in a mall. It's not like every
Yeah,
single like zombie movie was
yeah,
so
exactly.
like literal in terms
Yeah,
of
but
like
again, we get to this kind of problem with this school of kind of interpretation, which is that it's theoretical, right? Now there is another horror movie trend that happened in the 2000s that, for whatever reason, I am I buy much more. Maybe because it's a much cleaner map, right? So, starting in 2009, and then for about a decade, and I don't know how many horror movies you watch, but what do you think? Like, what do you associate with kind of the dominant mode of like horror movies starting in like 2010?
I don't know about 2010 exactly, but there's always some kind of haunting that's happening that's like that was started. There's always some kind of central mystery of something that happened long ago to cause this like demon or this like ghost or something. Yeah, I mean, you think of like The Ring and other things like that. Like some like horrific thing happened, and because of that, it's continuing to reverberate, throughout whatever, throughout
Right,
time.
right, yeah. Yeah, so the haunting genre especially in 2009 with the release of Paranormal Activity, right? Which and then that was the 2010s. It was Paranormal Activity clone after Paranormal Activity clone, right? And it was all these movies, people, which is of course has been a genre since the Amityville Horror in the 1970s, but it's a genre of people move into a house, and then it turns out the house is haunted, and then the ghosts in the house want to kill them, and there's no way out, right?
And there's always like a creepy child who somehow can intuit the existence of the ghost and starts basically manifesting some of its.
There is always a creepy child, isn't there? Yeah. So, what major national event happened about 2008, 2009 that lasted for about a decade?
The financial crisis.
The housing bubble collapsed. And all of a sudden, you find there are millions of people who are in houses that they bought on these variable rate interests, mortgages, that are now worth far less than they paid. And the house that they're in wants to kill them. It is threatening their lives and their livelihoods, right? Like when you're in a house and I mean, obviously it doesn't want to kill you, but that's what it has to feel like when you are in a house and your adjustable rate mortgage payment has ballooned to astronomical proportions and you can't get out because it is worth a third of what you paid for it, right? That's what it has to seem like, right? And for whatever reason, that maps really well to me, right? I think because the analogy is much cleaner, I'm more willing to buy it. But that has been an interpretation of the popularity of this sudden explosion of haunted house movies where a family moves into a house and then the house is haunted and then the house wants to kill them and then they can't get out. Exactly 1 year after the housing crisis starts, right? I don't know how that strikes you. It,
I
for
guess
whatever
now
reason,
that
I'm more
since we're
willing
in
to
like
buy it.
modern day, I'm starting to become more and more dubious of the entire concept that these trends are somehow some. I guess like they sort like there has to be something reflective of like what's going on in the real world, but like part of it is I just think that like there will be like one or two movies that just like do exceptionally well, and then the numbers crunchers in Hollywood who are very risk averse decide, hey, this thing works, so I'm going to green light more things like that.
Hmm.
And so I wonder if that's more of it. Like it's almost like also like music trends and stuff like that. While there'll be an explosion of boy bands. Well, NSYNC and Backstreet Boys were selling gobs of records, and then all of a sudden, every single music producer in the world was trying to get groups of boys together who could sing and were good looking. So I kind of like think of that being much more of it is that like culture leaps forward every few years, new trends come out, and then a bunch of artists or whatever are inspired by that thing, and so you'll see like an explosion of creativity that's iterations of that thing, and then it'll continue to transform. You see things like Mr. Beast now. There are just like so many. I don't know how much you follow YouTube culture and stuff like that, but this idea of the challenge video, like I buried myself alive for 7 days, or I gave away $10,000 to these strangers based on whether or not they could complete some tasks. And now there are just like so many Mr. Beast copycats. And so you see
Yeah.
that a lot. You see this a lot with like explosions and trends online, although they burn out a lot faster, like especially on like TikTok and stuff. I think it's more like somebody somebody is like really creative and does something a little bit different, and because it's different it explodes, and then a lot of other people are inspired by it and they start iterating on it, and then it gets so saturated that everybody gets really tired of it, and then it goes away. Like another one is like Casey Neistat. I don't know if you know who that is.
No idea.
So he's like a YouTuber, and he just like he built all these like Hollywood level skills in terms of editing and shooting and cinematography, and he applied them to YouTube. So he created like a daily vlog of his life, but it was the very first like vlog that looked like it was created by like a professional filmmaker, because he would like set up like different shots, like different versions of the same shots, where he would put like a camera
Yeah.
somewhere, whereas like all the vlogging before then was just like point and shoot, just like
You
this where
showed
he.
me Yeah, you showed me some of his videos. I remember years ago when I was visiting you in DC, because you were like kind of like trend spotting with it, and you're like, this guy is putting a level of like craft and camera work into it that nobody else is doing. I think there was one of him like there was a he was like skateboarding around, I think, and he had like a multi-camera setup, right?
Yeah, yeah. So like after he did that, there was like this explosion of daily vlogging, and like YouTube like very quickly got much more cinematic and professional in terms of like the level of like editing and shooting and stuff like that. So given like I cover the creator economy and media in like modern day, and just watching these like weird trends like constantly starting like all the time, and seeing how quickly they kind of move through culture. Obviously today it can move through culture much more quickly because everybody has a camera on them. Everybody can do kind of very basic editing. But back then it moved through, pre-internet, it moved through culture much more slowly, because only so many people could make a TV show or movie because it was like prohibitively expensive.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, we come into this kind of like problem of like being purely theoretical, right? We can map it to like an event that might just be completely coincidental. Um, might have been possible for people to find some sort of a outlet for their anxiety, or a escapism, a way to engage with something that they're thinking about anyway, even if they're not conscious of it. Or it could just be the fact that Paranormal Activity made like $200 million, and it was a cheap movie. And I think I looked up its budget was like $2 million. I mean, that's a hell of a return on investment. So shit, yeah, let's make some more Paranormal Activity movies. Um, so what if there were a way though to find these a kind of trend and look at it, and then actually know that, okay, this is uh, sort of being driven by consumers, right? And YouTube actually, in a way, offers us that, because there are trends of what kinds of videos are successful. What are people more likely to click on? what are people more likely to like, right? If you think of clicks and likes and plays as a kind of a vote, then I think YouTube actually offers us a way to sort of maybe draw some conclusions that aren't as purely theoretical, right? I mean, because, like if we're talking about, okay, sort of like back to the quicksand example, right? The one that we were both kind of dubious about anyway, right? I mean, if people were had so much anxiety about the quagmire of Vietnam that like we see it manifested in sort of like the popularity of quicksand, I mean, in the 2000s, I mean, we were getting involved in a much longer, open-ended, no way out wars than Vietnam in the form of Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan lasted longer than our involvement in Vietnam by a damn sight, and we didn't see like another kind of quagmire manifestation of pop culture, right? So when we're looking at these kind of purely theoretical examples, we're just kind of ended. We like it all comes back to that's interesting. It's a good analogy. There's no way to prove it. Which leads me to kind of what led me to this week's topic in the first place, which was, and I think I mentioned this last week, YouTube thumbnail faces. I accidentally got on YouTube when I wasn't logged in, and I saw just this sort of like generic home YouTube page. And there were I spent a while just like scrolling through it, and it's interesting to see when it's not personalized for you, because it was like page after page after page of these very similar looking thumbnails, and it's people pulling the YouTube thumbnail face. You know the face that I'm talking about, right?
Like mouth open, shocked at something.
Shocked or overly happy, just having this really exaggerated response, right? Which you don't do for the videos that you're posting on YouTube. Um, but yeah, it's like, and then like as if that actually happened to them, right? And so I started reading about YouTube thumbnail faces, and I came across some examples of YouTubers who had admitted that they tried not to do it, and they saw their views decrease by like 20-25%
Yeah, and
just by
like
not
so,
having the face.
yeah, and you can actually like A/B test thumbnails now. So you can like upload like 3 or 4 thumbnails or something like that, and then it'll be they'll just be shown at random to different people who are seeing your video, and then you can see which one actually drives the most clicks, and then choose that as your main thumbnail going forward. Like Mr. Beast does this, and like Mr. Beast's like team is like has tested it to down to the variable of whether he has his mouth open or not in the thumbnail. So like it is, yeah, like there is like some science behind it. There's some data behind it to show that somehow these thumbnails actually really do matter, and for that there needs to be some kind of strong reaction that it can't just be my face staring at the screen. I have to be like reacting to something.
Yeah, exactly. Like a and the YouTube thumbnail face has been around for a while, and we've seen it evolve, right? So I feel like, I mean, and people were writing articles like complaining about YouTube thumbnail faces like 5-6 years ago. Back then, there was a lot more sort of just random, really exaggerated emotions like angry or shocked or pain, right? And it was way over the top. Now it seems to be trending more toward, yeah, the Mr. Beast face, right? Which is the sort of, he's like a big like super happy, mouth open, so fucking joyful, right? But I mean, it works, right? I mean, like you said, I mean, you can test multiple thumbnails, and they've got that down to a science, and we know that having an exaggerated emotional face in a YouTube thumbnail makes people more likely to click on it, right? So why? And remember that figure that I quoted the last time that I presented, when I was talking about uh, the loneliness epidemic. And I use the word epidemic clinically because public health officials are calling it an epidemic, right? There's public health outcomes that are negative here, which is that the average person spends 4 to 6 hours per day on social media, but about 24 hours per year socializing in person, right? We are more connected to more people than at any time in any generation in history, right? And yet we're the loneliest that we've ever been. So that's what I started thinking of. And then I started thinking about, too, what's another trend that I've noticed a lot? And I have to tell YouTube, stop recommending this fucking channel to me. I first started noticing it because, okay, there's this YouTube channel that I like to watch called Drumeo, where they have like professional drummers listen to a song without a drum track and then improvise a drum part to it. It's always fun to like hear their takes on drum tracks. As soon as I started watching that, then every other recommended video on YouTube was a reaction video. Like, and it's really easy to be snarky about that. Like, Rick and Morty has a joke where I think Rick says, like, your generation watches videos of people watching videos. You have nothing to say to me, right? But it was all these recommended videos like drummer reacts to Drumeo video, right? And they're everywhere. There's people reacting to comedians, people reacting to songs, vocal coach reacts to a performance, guitar teacher reacts to a
Yeah, there's CGI experts react to bad CGI in these movies or something that's
or
one.
good CGI, right? And so, but like if you look up the vast majority of these, and so I spent some time clicking around, like reacting to a drum performance, reacting to a guitarist, reacting to a singer, reacting to blah blah blah, right? By and large, they're positive. Reacting to a comedian, it's just people laughing at a comedian, right? There's like this whole YouTube channel, and I forget the name, but it's these two guys that just watch comedians and then they laugh about it together, right? By and large, they're popular, right? So again, like I don't think people would be producing so many reaction videos still, and they've been doing it since what the Fine Brothers started at like 8 or 9 years ago. If it didn't work, right? These reaction videos are easy ways to produce content, and people click on them and they watch them. And it seemed to me just from like half an hour of clicking through reaction videos today that yeah, the majority of them are generally positive. So what if? So in both the fact that we know that like exaggerated emotional faces on thumbnails will get you more views. Like that is a science that is confirmed. And the popularity of these reaction videos, right? What is drawing people? Like if you watch a video of a song that you like why do you want to watch somebody else watching the song that you like? Or why do you want to watch these reaction videos? What if it's going back to another manifestation of just sort of like a general disconnection from other people? Like general societal loneliness. What if we're so hungry for human connection that even the experience of watching a video where somebody else watches a video that you liked and telling you that they liked it too can serve this parasocial function, even though you know they're not really talking to you? You get a little dopamine boost. You get that little bump, right? You can imagine that you have shared an experience with a human being. And what if that's also why these exaggerated, like emotional face thumbnails are so popular, right? It's because people, without even really knowing why they're doing it, they're attracted to an example of human emotion. They're literally trying to reach out and touch someone, I guess, to use like a poor kind of trademarked phrase about it. But you know, what if both of these things are back in this sort of like if we're talking about these sort of like collective manifestations, right? We're in the loneliness epidemic. We have the highest self-reported rate of loneliness since they started like tracking it in the 70s. Um, People are not really socializing in person anymore. They're spending all their time on social media. We've lost third places. We don't meet people anymore. We don't really hang out with our friends in person. Like, what if, in higher ed, it's something that we're talking about a lot, is the fact that freshmen, when they come into campus, they don't make new friends. They bring their old friends with them from high school on TikTok and on social media, and we don't know how to get them to interact. We don't know how to get them to socialize. What if we're actually seeing one of these societal manifestations of anxieties, and we're actually seeing an example that's actually being driven by the decisions of consumers? So that's my question to end my presentation on, and to ask you, as somebody who follows this, thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, like I've obviously I don't know about specifically like thumbnail faces and stuff like that. Obviously, We probably are experiencing the rise of the parasocial relationship to an extent to where we've never done it before, where like like even me, like I have a podcast, it's only listened to by a few thousand people. And when I meet people who actually listen to the podcast, they just talk about how like weird it was, weird an experience it is to like talk to me. And like this one time, like this guy asked me to lunch, to he was a fan of the podcast, and it just turns out this guy was like way more famous than me. Like he was, had spent the last like 15 year or 10 years as like a Fox News contributor. Now he's like a regular contributor to NBC. Like if you saw this guy's face, you would recognize it. So, and he's millions of people know who he is. So he's like way more famous than I am. And so like I met him for lunch at sushi, and he was like, I'm kind of like starstruck right now because I've been listening to your podcast for so long, and there's just something about like having these this person's like voice being beamed into your ear that creates like this parasocial relationship. And now you're able to have parasocial relationships with very tiny audiences. Like I have a very tiny audience. So tying that to kind of like the loneliness epidemic, and the difficulty of making friends and connections like that, I would not be surprised. And because like Brad Pitt does not seem down to earth, like you don't feel like you could be friends with Brad Pitt, but you do feel like you could be friends with this kind of like regular Joe Schmo who has a TikTok account or a YouTube channel or a podcast or something like that. I think like the parasocial relationship could be,
Yeah,
much higher.
especially with a reaction video too. You're like, yeah, this person liked the same video that I did. He also talked about how great it was. Yeah, of course we have so much in common, right? So that's pretty much where I was going with my momentary expert presentation today. Is not really coming to a conclusion, but just a question. Which again, even though we can track this sort of development through clicks and likes and views and trends, of course, it still remains ultimately theoretical. But I hope it was convincing, or at least more convincing than the quicksand one. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, like it's hard to do a causation, but it like these weird things like the quicksand or the westerns. It's like, yeah, like why the hell were there? I mean, that was just fascinating that there were like 88 TV shows on a
or
like
1,200
a
movies.
on like a handful of networks when there weren't even like the cable ecosystem that we have now. Like, why
Yeah.
were we so obsessed with this one thing? And like, is it like causation that like, is it something in the wider world, or was it just like the first few were very novel and then people just decided they liked that genre and then they got tired of it? Same thing with like that's
Yeah.
happening with superheroes movies now. Is like, we tried a few, some of them were duds. Then there was like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, which was like the first like true like blockbuster superhero, at least in the Marvel, so like the Marvel side. And then we tried a bunch of fits and starts, and then Iron Man is when we really hit our stride as a culture in terms of being able to reliably produce like high quality like superhero fare. And then suddenly they were just everywhere. But now, flash forward to 2024, and we're just all sick of them. So now they're starting to bomb in the box office and probably kind of on their way out. And will superheroes movies ever go away completely? Probably not. But they'll probably be like westerns today. They'll never be as popular or as ubiquitous as the 1950s and 60s. But now people today will try to come up with new spins on the western, new ideas for how to have a new take on it and stuff like that. So
Yeah. Which is why I was so interested then, in this idea of looking at YouTube sort of popularity because it is so user driven. A lot of these things that, I mean, you, obviously the thumbnail faces don't seem to be going anywhere, and they've been around for a while, and it's still working. And the reaction videos have been around for a while, and they're still working. And they would not be here if they didn't work, if they didn't draw views. If there was a sudden next year nobody was clicking on reaction videos and the viewership had declined by 99, like people wouldn't be making them anymore, right?
yeah, I guess I just like I guess I'm just skeptical that like it's like a one to one causation thing of anything that's going on in the wider world. It's just that, like probably like what's going on in the world shapes everything in some way indirectly, but it's not as direct as that. Like for instance, like there was this one time like a year ago where sea shanties suddenly got like super popular on TikTok, and it was because like one guy just like uploaded a sea shanty movie this song that, and you're like, wow, this is actually like really entertaining and really,
Yeah, but then they also
really
went away
creative.
really, really quickly, right? Whereas opposed to sort of these longer term trims of exaggerated emotional YouTube thumbnail faces and like reaction videos have been around for a long time and they're still working, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm gonna go make a I mean, that was around for like a few months, right? And I'm not trying to claim a one to one, right? Because obviously nothing is so simple as that. But I would propose that it is a contributing possibility worth further exploration and discussion. And that's where I'll end on.
Uh, all right. Well, anything else before we sign off for the day?
What do you got for me next week? What are you thinking about?
I don't know. I mean, I was just at a cabin all weekend. I slept 12 hours last night and have been kind of exhausted. I kind of like haven't really, I have like a whole Google Doc of things, but I haven't really chosen what I want to focus on to do the research for next week yet. So I don't know.
Are you
We'll
going to
see.
tell
I'll
us all about
probably,
how when you were in a cabin you had a Walden moment and then you
yeah, I
you
sort of
discovered
did,
self
but I
awareness?
think it's there. It was an interesting weekend, but it's not the kind of thing I might want to talk about on a podcast. But I'm sure I'll tell you about it at some point.
Okay,
All right, man.
cool.
Well, thanks, Craig. This
Yeah.
was a lot of fun. I'll see you
Yeah.
next week.
See you next week, buddy.